There are apparently protesters going around holding flags.
Every day for 10 years, I have been bullied and attacked, and I was the most trolled person in the entire world, man or woman. And I'm still here.
Australia has once again become the stage where every move made by Meghan Markle and Prince Harry is examined in real time, pulled apart, amplified, and transformed into global conversation. But this time, the atmosphere feels noticeably different. It doesn't feel like a structured royal-style visit or a predictable sequence of appearances moving neatly from one engagement to the next. The energy feels sharper, more divided, almost as if people are no longer simply talking about them, but talking through them, using them as symbols in much larger debates about media, celebrity, influence, and public identity. And before we go deeper into this, make sure to subscribe if you want more breakdowns like this, because what's happening here is bigger than just one trip. At the center of the latest storm is a single statement that changed the tone almost instantly. While speaking to a group of Australian students, Meghan made a comment that immediately spread far beyond the room itself. She said she had spent 10 years every single day being bullied. She also stated that she believed she was one of the most trolled people in the world. There was no hesitation in the delivery, no attempt to soften the wording or dilute the emotion behind it. The comment landed with a directness that made the room pause for a moment, but outside that space, the reaction was immediate and intense. Within minutes, social media exploded.
Aussies take no bullshit, and it's not working. One woman who was on board Meghan Markle and Prince Harry's Qantas flight told the MSM of the Duchess, "I don't like her at all. Don't come to Australia. You don't belong here. We don't want you here."
Headlines moved quickly across platforms, and comment sections turned into arguments almost instantly. Supporters defended her strongly, arguing that her words reflected a reality people had watched unfold for years. They pointed to the relentless scrutiny surrounding her public life, where every appearance, every expression, every outfit, and every decision becomes material for endless online debate and criticism. To those supporters, the statement did not feel exaggerated. It felt overdue. Critics, however, interpreted it very differently. Many did not deny that Meghan has faced extraordinary levels of public attention, but they questioned the framing itself. The claim of being the most trolled person in the world became the focus of the backlash. Opponents argued that online harassment is a much broader issue affecting countless individuals, including activists, journalists, politicians, celebrities, and ordinary people with no public platform at all. To them, the statement felt too absolute, too centered around one perspective within a much larger digital problem. And that is where the divide deepened most visibly. Because in today's media environment, perception forms at extraordinary speed. A single sentence becomes a headline, the headline becomes an identity marker, and that identity marker is then repeated endlessly in debates that often have less to do with the original comment itself and more to do with what people already believe.
And have a look at this. We have to fund it. Yes, us hard-working taxpayers have to pay for them.
All of this is being supported by the British royal family as part of Operation Thaw.
For Meghan, this moment became another layer added to an already deeply divided public image. One side sees vulnerability, honesty, and someone speaking openly about years of pressure. The other side sees self-focus, exaggeration, and carefully shaped narrative framing. Both interpretations now exist simultaneously, feeding off one another in real time. And just as that conversation began settling into familiar camps, Harry entered an entirely different controversy that quickly generated just as much discussion. While Meghan's comments dominated conversations around online bullying, Harry focused on digital safety, specifically praising Australia's push towards stricter social media restrictions for users under 16. He described the policy as epic leadership, a phrase that instantly drew attention because of both its tone and timing. At first glance, the comment appeared straightforward. Supporters interpreted it as a responsible stance on protecting young people from the harmful effects of social media, especially considering growing concerns around online addiction, harassment, and mental health. In that context, Harry's comments aligned with broader international discussions already taking place around digital regulation and youth well-being. But critics immediately pushed back here too. Some argued that there was a contradiction in publicly criticizing the dangers of digital spaces, while simultaneously relying so heavily on media visibility and online engagement to maintain influence and relevance. Others viewed the statement less as policy commentary and more as part of a carefully shaped public identity centered around moral authority and social advocacy. And that's what makes this entire Australia trip feel so charged. Nothing remains isolated anymore. Every speech becomes symbolic. Every comment becomes part of a larger narrative. Every appearance is interpreted not only for what it is, but for what people believe it represents underneath the surface. That is why this visit feels different from earlier ones. The reactions are no longer unified. They are fragmented, emotional, and constantly shifting between support and skepticism, depending on who is watching. And in that environment, even the smallest moment can instantly become part of a much larger, global argument. They pointed to what they saw as a contradiction. A couple whose visibility, influence, and global relevance are deeply tied to media coverage and digital platforms were now publicly supporting tighter restrictions on those same online spaces. To supporters, there was no contradiction at all. They argued that Harry's comments were specifically about protecting younger users from harmful online environments, not limiting free expression or shutting down digital communication entirely. But critics interpreted it differently. To them, the message felt layered and conflicted, as if two separate narratives were trying to exist side by side without fully aligning. And just like that, the conversation surrounding the tour expanded again. Even smaller details suddenly started carrying symbolic weight. During the visit, attention began shifting towards subtle elements of Meghan's styling and public presentation that, in another context, might have passed unnoticed. In particular, mama-themed references connected to her image started circulating widely online. What could have been viewed as a simple personal expression quickly became another subject of interpretation and debate. For some observers, those details suggested a deliberate repositioning of her public identity, presenting herself as more grounded, more relatable, and further removed from the polished expectations traditionally associated with royal life. The messaging felt softer, more personal, and more lifestyle-oriented. But in the environment surrounding this tour, nothing remained simple for long. Because once a public narrative starts forming, every detail gets absorbed into it. Every image, every phrase, every outfit becomes part of a much larger conversation about intention and presentation. At the same time, the tour began feeding into a broader discussion about the way modern public figures operate in today's media culture, where lifestyle, identity, influence, and business no longer function separately, but merge together into one continuous system. Visibility itself becomes part of the product. Public appearances become branding opportunities, and audiences increasingly interpret even personal choices through a commercial lens. That level of scrutiny only intensified as attention shifted toward Meghan's evolving public image, especially her wardrobe and presentation choices throughout the trip. What once might have been dismissed as ordinary celebrity fashion coverage now carries a very different meaning. Some observers noted how frequently her outfits changed between appearances, suggesting it may not simply reflect personal style, but a carefully managed branding approach tied to influence culture and lifestyle marketing. Conversations quickly moved beyond aesthetics into commerce, with discussions surrounding curated looks, online shopping links, and audiences recreating her style through digital platforms. Supporters viewed this as a natural evolution of modern celebrity influence. To them, it reflected adaptability in a digital-first era where fashion, visibility, and entrepreneurship naturally overlap. In that interpretation, style becomes empowerment and visibility becomes opportunity. Critics, however, interpreted the same dynamic very differently. To them, the image felt increasingly structured, commercialized, and strategically managed in real time. Rather than seeing authenticity, they saw branding. Rather than evolution, they saw constant repositioning. And once again, everything came down to perspective. What supporters described as modern influence, critics framed as calculated image management, Yet nothing during the Australian tour triggered a sharper divide than Meghan's unexpected appearance on MasterChef Australia. By that point, the visit was already under intense public scrutiny, but this moment introduced an entirely new layer of debate involving celebrity culture, authority, credibility, and entertainment value all at once. Inside a brightly lit kitchen filled with contestants, cameras, and a massive viewing audience, the discussion surrounding Meghan shifted almost instantly from advocacy and public engagement to qualifications and relevance. Her appearance was introduced as a special guest moment, but it rapidly became one of the most talked about aspects of the entire trip. Supporters embraced it enthusiastically. They described the appearance as relaxed, engaging, and confident, arguing that it showed Meghan comfortably navigating modern entertainment spaces outside the traditional royal framework. To them, the appearance aligned naturally with her public interests in food, wellness, lifestyle media, and storytelling. Clips showing her smiling, interacting warmly with contestants, and moving easily within the format spread quickly online, reinforcing an image of adaptability and media confidence. But critics responded just as strongly in the opposite direction. Questions flooded social media almost immediately. Why was a former royal appearing as a guest judge on a competitive cooking program? What exactly qualified her for the role? Some viewers argued that celebrity recognition was being prioritized over culinary expertise, turning what they viewed as a respected competition into another publicity-driven media moment. The reactions ranged from confusion to outright frustration. For some, the issue was not Meghan herself, but what her appearance symbolized. It fed into a larger concern that entertainment culture increasingly rewards visibility and name recognition over subject matter expertise. Others viewed it as another example of how the tour seemed to move constantly between humanitarian imagery, lifestyle branding, celebrity media, and commercial influence without fully settling into any single identity. And that uncertainty is exactly what continues to fuel such divided reactions. Some argued that judging roles on a program like MasterChef Australia should remain firmly within professional culinary circles, reserved for chefs and industry experts whose experience directly relates to the competition itself. Others pointed toward Meghan's previous media, wellness, and lifestyle ventures as part of a much broader conversation about the direction of her public identity, questioning whether this appearance represented another calculated step in an ongoing brand evolution. Then another layer entered the discussion entirely: titles. For many viewers, confusion resurfaced around why she continues to be referred to as Duchess, despite stepping away from official royal duties years ago. That detail alone reignited a familiar debate about status, identity, and public positioning. Some argued that the continued use of royal titles while operating primarily in celebrity and media spaces creates an ongoing contradiction that the public still hasn't fully resolved, and that single issue added even more fuel to an already divided reaction. At the same time, however, a strong counter-response continued building online and across sections of the media. Supporters defended her appearance enthusiastically, emphasizing her confidence, warmth, and ability to connect naturally in front of cameras. To them, the MasterChef moment represented a modern form of visibility, someone moving comfortably between entertainment, advocacy, and lifestyle influence without being confined to traditional expectations. Some viewers even framed her involvement as symbolic rather than technical. In their eyes, the appearance was never truly about culinary expertise. It was about presence, cultural relevance, and the ability to attract attention to a platform through personality alone. But the criticism never really disappeared. Comments questioning her credibility, her relevance to the format, and even the broader direction of the show itself continued circulating widely online. And that's exactly what makes this entire moment feel so unstable and emotionally charged, because it stopped being about a television cameo almost immediately. Instead, it became about interpretation. To critics, the appearance looked like another carefully managed step in a larger transformation where visibility itself becomes currency, and every platform becomes an opportunity for expansion. In that interpretation, television appearances, wellness branding, emotional storytelling, and public advocacy all begin blending together into one continuous commercial ecosystem. To supporters, however, it reflected something far simpler. A public figure adapting to a modern media world where traditional boundaries barely exist anymore. In today's landscape, celebrities move between industries constantly. Entertainment, philanthropy, business, activism, and lifestyle branding overlap all the time. From that perspective, Meghan's appearance didn't feel unusual at all. It felt current. And that divide is not shrinking. If anything, it continues getting wider. Because in Australia, where every part of this visit is unfolding in real time, those two completely different interpretations keep colliding every single day. The result is a public conversation that refuses to settle into one clear narrative. Every statement becomes a headline. Every appearance becomes a debate. Every image gets pulled apart and reinterpreted depending on who is watching. And as the tour continues, one thing becomes increasingly obvious. This is no longer simply about Meghan Markle or Prince Harry as individuals. It's about what they represent. Because once public figures reach this level of visibility, almost nothing they do remains neutral anymore. Ordinary actions stop feeling ordinary. Every gesture carries symbolic meaning. Every public moment becomes part of a much larger cultural argument, shaped by audiences projecting their own beliefs, frustrations, admiration, or skepticism onto them. And right now in Australia, that attention feels especially intense, almost like the entire visit has become a lightning rod for much broader conversations about celebrity, royalty, media influence, and authenticity. Strip away the polished photos, the carefully timed visits, and the emotionally resonant public appearances, and one uncomfortable question continues surfacing underneath everything else. Is this compassion? Or is it choreography? That is where the sharpest criticism begins to emerge. Not around fashion, speeches, or titles, but around optics themselves. More specifically, critics point toward the repeated use of emotionally sensitive settings, hospitals, vulnerable communities, shelters, and outreach spaces as the backdrop for highly visible public moments. Some observers are beginning to question whether these appearances function purely as humanitarian engagement or whether they also operate as part of a broader narrative strategy designed to shape public perception in real time. Because through a more critical lens, a pattern starts becoming difficult for some people to ignore. A visit to sick children can instantly shift public emotion. A stop at a homelessness center can soften criticism almost immediately. And when those images dominate headlines and social feeds, it becomes harder for some audiences to separate emotional response from media framing. That's exactly why the backlash feels so sharp and emotionally loaded. Critics argue that emotionally sensitive environments should never be perceived as protective layers for a public image. In their view, hospitals, shelters, and vulnerable communities carry a seriousness that should remain separate from branding, media strategy, or personal positioning. The concern is not necessarily about whether the visits themselves are genuine, but about the possibility that these settings can start being interpreted as strategically valuable because of the emotional response they naturally generate. And that is where the tension surrounding this trip becomes much harder to untangle. Because the more closely people examine it, the more complicated even the word tour begins to feel. What is unfolding in Australia does not fully resemble a traditional royal tour, but it also does not look entirely like a simple humanitarian visit either. Instead, it exists somewhere in between. Part public service, part media presence, part personal brand expansion. And it is precisely that mixture that continues making audiences uneasy. The lines feel blurred. While the public-facing moments focus heavily on empathy, connection, and emotional engagement, another parallel conversation keeps running quietly in the background, one centered around paid speaking. Appearances, branded experiences, private events, and structured forms of visibility tied to influence and access. And that contrast is where phrases like performative philanthropy begin surfacing more frequently in online discussions and commentary. Supporters reject that interpretation completely. To them, this represents independence, a modern approach to building influence and purpose outside rigid institutional systems. They see Harry and Meghan as public figures using visibility to highlight causes while simultaneously creating careers that no longer depend on royal structures. Critics, however, see something far more calculated. In their interpretation, purpose itself becomes part of the packaging. Advocacy becomes intertwined with image building. Emotional engagement becomes inseparable from publicity and branding. And sitting above all of this is something that never fully disappears, no matter how far they move away from it. The monarchy. Even without official royal duties, the institution still frames how people interpret them. Their titles remain part of public conversation. Comparisons to working royals continue constantly. Even the visual structure of these appearances, community visits, formal welcomes, carefully staged engagements, still echoes royal tradition in ways that are difficult to separate completely. That's where another uncomfortable question begins forming. Are Harry and Meghan truly moving away from the institution, or are they still operating within its visual and symbolic framework whenever it remains useful? Because visually, so much of the trip still feels familiar. The pacing, the settings, the symbolism, the public walkabouts, the outreach spaces, it all resembles the structure of official royal duty, even without the constitutional role behind it. And that is exactly where the phrase quasi-royal starts gaining traction among critics and commentators. The idea describes a version of royal visibility and presentation that still carries the appearance of monarchy, but without the formal obligations, restrictions, or accountability attached to working royal life. Then, there is Harry's praise for Australia's proposed under-16 social media restrictions, which he described as epic leadership. On the surface, the comment fits naturally into broader conversations about online safety and protecting younger audiences from digital harm. Supporters interpreted it as straightforward advocacy connected to issues Harry has spoken about for years, particularly mental health and the psychological effects of online environments. But within the broader context of this tour, critics interpreted it differently once again. To them, the statement felt like another carefully positioned alignment with socially popular causes, issues that naturally generate public approval while reinforcing a specific public identity built around mental health, online harm, emotional well-being, and youth protection. And once again, interpretation split sharply. Supporters saw advocacy, critics saw positioning, because in this environment, even intention itself becomes something audiences argue over constantly. This is where the idea of quasi-royal behavior becomes even more pronounced. Visually, structurally, and symbolically, many of these appearances still mirror official royal engagements so closely that the distinction often feels blurred to the public eye. And that ambiguity keeps fueling debate because both interpretations can exist at the same time depending on how someone chooses to read the situation. Supporters argue that visibility is exactly what gives these causes power. In their view, attention is not the problem. It is the mechanism that amplifies important issues to a global audience. The platform itself is the point. Critics counter with something much more uncomfortable. They argue that attention itself becomes the transaction, and that emotionally charged environments provide the emotional weight that makes the visibility valuable in the first place. Layered on top of all of this is a constant sense of performance, not necessarily in a dishonest sense, but in a deeply modern one. Every public appearance is instantly transformed into content the moment it happens. Photos circulate immediately, clips spread online within minutes, headlines form in real time, reactions multiply endlessly across platforms. The moment stops belonging to the people physically present and becomes part of the internet's continuous cycle of interpretation and debate. And that is the real tension sitting at the center of everything. Nothing is simply an event anymore. Everything becomes a signal. And in that kind of environment, even sincerity no longer moves quietly through the world. It gets analyzed, questioned, debated, reframed, and pulled apart from every possible angle. That is why this Australia trip no longer feels like a simple series of appearances. It feels more like one long unfolding argument happening in real time, with every new moment immediately absorbed into a larger debate that neither side seems willing to let go of. A hospital visit is no longer viewed as just a hospital visit. For supporters, it represents compassion, visibility, and attention brought to people who deserve to be seen. For critics, the exact same moment can look like image management carefully framed inside emotionally powerful environments. The same image creates two completely different realities depending on who is looking at it. And that split follows them everywhere now. A speech about mental health becomes either advocacy or branding. A television appearance becomes either confidence or calculated visibility. A comment about online bullying becomes either honesty or self-positioning. Even silence itself gets interpreted as strategy. That is the environment Harry and Meghan are operating inside now, one where there's almost no neutral ground left. And perhaps that is what makes this moment feel so much heavier than previous tours or public appearances. The reactions are no longer just emotional. They are ideological. People are not simply responding to what Harry and Meghan do. They are responding to what they believe Harry and Meghan represent. To some, they symbolize independence from an outdated institution, modern influence, openness about mental health, and the attempt to build a life outside rigid royal systems. To others, they symbolize celebrity activism, constant rebranding, blurred boundaries between service and profit, and a reliance on royal identity that never fully disappears. Both interpretations now exist at the same time, colliding constantly in public conversation. And Australia has become the perfect stage for that collision because the contrast is impossible to ignore. This was once one of the strongest success stories of their royal years. Back in 2018, the atmosphere felt uncomplicated. Crowds were loud, excitement felt natural, the public reaction seemed unified. Now everything feels fractured, the enthusiasm is more restrained, the reactions are more divided, the symbolism is more complicated. And every appearance seems to generate two entirely different narratives simultaneously. That is why the conversation surrounding this visit feels so intense. It is not really about one speech, one television appearance, or one headline anymore. It is about identity itself, who Harry and Meghan are now, what role they occupy in global culture, and whether the public still sees them through the lens they are trying to present. Because once perception becomes unstable, every detail starts carrying weight. Every smile becomes analyzed. Every crowd reaction becomes symbolic. Every appearance becomes evidence for whichever narrative people already believe. And maybe that is the real story unfolding here. Not whether the tour was successful or unsuccessful, not whether the criticism is fair or unfair, but the fact that Harry and Meghan now exist inside a space where almost nothing they do can simply exist on its own anymore. Everything becomes part of the argument, everything becomes part of the performance. And in today's media landscape, once a public figure reaches that point, controlling the narrative becomes almost impossible, because the story no longer belongs entirely to them.